What that means is if you look at downtown Vancouver, which is on the peninsula in the kind of far west, and you look at Surrey City Centre, which is in North Surrey, just across the river from New Westminster, there are actually more people proximate to Surrey City Centre, and that's growing at a faster rate than to downtown Vancouver.
Hold up.
Hi everyone, it's Paul David Eskew from Level Up Mortgages. I'm here with Michael Heeney from the Surrey City Development Corporation, aka
SCDC.
Okay, whichever one works for you, but it's a mouthful name, but you have a mouthful and a lot of interesting projects. I'm really excited to get into things. First of all, Michael, thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, no kidding.
I'm happy to have you out in Surrey.
Yes, I know, and it's crazy. I'm even though I grew up in Vancouver and of course know all your children, I never wandered over here except for, as I was telling you, drinking beer downstairs at Central City Brewery. But wow, there's a lot going on. So getting into things, I mean, first and foremost, you have a really interesting position, and I think what the company does is equally interesting as far as the incentives you have, and it's a bit of your mandate. So why don't we talk a bit about, like, just first of all, your past experiences, what landed you in this position, and what, in your opinion, inspired you about it, and then we'll talk a bit more about the actual company.
Sure. Well, actually, maybe I should talk just a little bit about the company and then why I was attracted to it.
Okay, perfect.
So SCDC, the Surrey City Development Corporation, we're kind of an odd animal because we're a for-profit development company.
Right.
We have to make a profit. We're incorporated like a regular real estate company.
Yeah.
I report to an independent board of directors who provide guidance to the company and make sure we operate according to best business practices.
Yeah.
But our shareholder is the City of Surrey, so we're 100% owned by the City of Surrey.
Okay, interesting.
And what that means, amongst other things, is it means that we have kind of a dual mandate. So we're not just driven to make money. We do have to make money, and we actually provide a dividend to the city of about $4.5 million a year. And we're building up a portfolio of we have been building up a portfolio of real estate, which is now worth almost $250 million.
Oh well, all in here?
In this across the city.
Yeah.
But the mandate is twofold. So while we have to make money, and we'd all lose our jobs if we don't, we also have to do focus on projects that are really going to advance the city in a positive way. Yeah. And in particular, projects that the private sector might not ordinarily want to take on their own. Either it appears a little bit too risky, or they just wouldn't want to touch it, lead the market a little bit. So our job is kind of to lead the market a little bit, so we kind of prove the market out, which is a little bit easier for us to do. We only work in Surrey, and so we know this market extremely well. Most developers work in multiple different jurisdictions, and so we have a sense of where the market's going in some ways, just because we're here all the time, and we understand all the challenges and advantages of working in Surrey. So so we've been quite a good partner. Typically, we partner with the private sector on all of our projects.
Right.
So my background is I'm an architect, and I practiced for over 30 years in Vancouver and around the world, out of Vancouver. Yeah. But one of the places that we did work was in Surrey, and in particular, about 16 years ago, we completed a project called Central City, which is where we are now. And Central City is a really intriguing mixed-use project, which there's nothing really in the world that has been built quite like that. So what it was there was a declining shopping center called Surrey Place Mall. Right. And we were able to facilitate bringing together a number of different groups, and we on top of that mall, which is about 600,000 square feet, we added 1 million square feet of other development, which included a new university, which is now to SFU Surrey, and an office building on top of that. Yeah. And the reason that was so kind of impactful and catalytic was, for many years, the region has been trying to get a city center going in Surrey. Right. And this project was the first project where people sort of stood up and took notice and realized that there was enormous potential here that made a lot of sense. So for me, this opportunity to run SCDC was kind of a dream job for an architect, because, because it allows you to really push the kind of city building side, which is what drives you as an architect to sort of make a difference to this world, but to do it in a more powerful, meaningful way. So SCDC this last 3 years here has been a dream in many respects for me to work on that. So I've been able to sort of expand really what we started with Central City. And then after Central City, the sort of city of Surrey kind of got religion, and they invested in the city center. They moved City Hall here, they built a library. And SFU's enjoyed enormous success as well, and they've been expanding and will continue to expand. So.
Yeah. That's great. Wow. So lots happening. And I think it's very interesting too how you have like your for-profit, right? But the mandate is kind of like, it's very specific to Surrey. So like, even though it might make financial sense to expand somewhere else, your shareholders would be like, well, that doesn't really make sense, right? Or would there eventually be autonomy for you guys to do?
Well, no. I mean, we're very much a child of the city, and in fact, the current mayor wants to bring the activities closer and inside of the city.
Right.
So that's got its own set of sort of challenges, but we certainly would never do work outside of Surrey.
Right. But you of course collaborate with other municipalities on things.
We just work in Surrey.
Huh?
But we do have. I'd like to feel that we do projects which really advance the region. So we do think beyond Surrey. And we are looking to partner with the private sector historically, and increasingly we're looking to partner with senior government. Because again, there's huge strategic reasons that it's advantageous for senior governments to have, particularly in the Surrey City Centre, succeed and grow. Because if you think of Metro Vancouver as comprehensively as a region, Surrey is strategically very important. It's the Surrey City Centre is in the centre of the region. It's actually in North Surrey. It's not in the centre of Surrey. And Surrey's population is going to surpass Vancouver probably in a dozen years. It's growing twice as fast.
Wow.
And in fact, if you look at the regional growth, it's all coming towards Surrey and away from Vancouver. Vancouver's doing a great job densifying. They're building more and more towers, but there's only so many towers. You can only go so high. And so the real growth is actually happening south of the Fraser. And that's something you mentioned at your intro, that you hadn't come out here much. And that's, I say this as a Vancouverite myself, is you kind of don't think about what's happening on the other side of the river, but this is where the action is. And it's incredibly exciting to be a part of that.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. And I guess let's talk about the importance of creating this sort of this Surrey City Centre as the next downtown, because you're saying it's going to be there in a dozen years. Remember when we looked at the map, kind of went for a walk, of course, and I was like, holy crap, I feel like a total tourist again. You showed a bit about how, if you actually look at the map and you see how it really is the center of almost BC almost. It's pretty interesting to kind of see that. And then you talked about the square footage of what office and residentials.
Yeah, so if you think of that was
really interesting.
Well, if you think of the region, and this is something that people don't tend to think about unless they're kind of planners or planner nerds, is Vancouver geographically is really unusual. It's very different from most cities. And that we've got these huge geographic constraints. We've got mountains on the north, which prevents the city, for the region, from moving to the north. We've got ocean on the west and kind of coming down to the south, so we can't expand that direction. So we can really only grow in one direction. And that's profoundly inefficient, but it's also advantageous because you kind of know where the growth is going to go. If you compared it to, say, Calgary, where there's virtually no geographic constraints, it can kind of grow in 360 degrees, which is good in the sense that you can have the central business district in the center, and so people can kind of grow concentrically out from that. But you don't really know which direction is going to be primary, so you don't really know where to put your investment.
As a business person or as a...
Or just as planners, developers, whatever, right? So then you think of Vancouver, we've got this, we can really only grow in kind of one direction, so you know where you should be making your investments. And so there was a very famous plan called the Livable Region Plan that was created in the 70s and 80s, where they realized, well, it's super inefficient to have your downtown on an extremity on a peninsula, and having people move further and further away from it. And so to offset that, they thought, well, why don't we have a series of satellites of town centers working their way down to the southeast? And in the mid 80s, when they built the SkyTrain line, the Expo line, they started to connect these city centers. That really literally set them in concrete. And the largest of those was always meant to be Surrey, sort of across the river and serving the sort of the valley valley, and for a variety of reasons, it's been slower to pick up, and it really wasn't until the Central City project that it's got going.
Right, that was a catalyst.
But as I mentioned, the population is moving to the southeast. So if you identify where the center of the population is, so a point in the region where there's an equal number of people in all directions from you, that point is actually kind of New Westminster, sort of Burnaby border, and it's moving to the southeast all the time. And so what that means is if you look at downtown Vancouver, which is on the peninsula in the kind of far west, and you look at Surrey City Centre, which is in North Surrey, just across the river from New Westminster, there are actually more people proximate to Surrey City Centre, and that's growing at a faster rate than to downtown Vancouver.
And that's important because you want people to just equal access?
It just makes sense to be closer to where you work. So the disconnect is that downtown Vancouver, the downtown peninsula, there's 27 million square feet of office space.
Right.
And there's another 4 million that's kind of under construction or in the pipeline to get going. Surrey City Centre, which is geographically about the same area, it's the last 3 SkyTrain stops, it has 1.5 million square feet. So just a fraction of the office space of downtown. And there's maybe, if you squint, there's maybe 1 million square feet in the pipeline to come. So there's this enormous disconnect where we've got the workers in the region further and further away, living further and further away from where they are, and that has big implications. So it's for one thing, it's putting huge strains on the infrastructure. Like the SkyTrain and the highways are packed getting to downtown Vancouver. They're practically empty going the other direction.
Right, that's crazy.
The building more and more office space in downtown Vancouver is putting huge pressures on housing stock. So that's one of the reasons we're seeing this enormous rise in values and affordability crisis in Vancouver. So Surrey...
The office building side has a big influence there.
Yeah, exactly, because people want to live near where they work, right? So they're going to live in smaller and smaller places and pay more and more money per square foot to live there, to be close to where they work. So what's interesting is Surrey has a different kind of housing. For one thing, Surrey is 35% more affordable than downtown Vancouver.
Right. Yeah.
As a result, this is where the families live. If you
in detached mainly, or this?
Well, actually, not. No, there's the same. It's a very interesting statistic. So there are actually, I think it's around 35, 37% of Surrey live in single-family homes, which is exactly the same as the city of Vancouver.
Right.
The big difference is there are fewer people in Surrey that live in high-rises. And that's starting to change. If you can see all the cranes around here. That market is being exploited now. But over 60%, I think 65% of the housing in Surrey has 3 or more bedrooms. So that's really because it's people talk about the missing middle. Well, it's actually not missing. It's in Surrey, and the missing middle housing is housing the families. And so it's almost 30% of Surrey's population is under 19. So this is where the families are living. And in Vancouver, 65% of the housing is actually 1 bedroom or less. So if you're in your 20s, you're living in Vancouver. But once you kind of hit mid-30s, you actually move out this way. And so I think that's going to be a huge reckoning in sort of 10 years. So right now, the tech market has discovered they want to be downtown because they all poach from each other. They want to be near the talent. But that talent in 10 years, those guys are going to have kids and they're not going to be living downtown. They're actually going to be living out here. And so so it becomes really urgent to start thinking, and any kind of progressive employer that's worried about being a competitive employer 10 years from now should be thinking about Surrey, because to do a development of any scale is going to take 5 to 10 years anyway, right? So you've got to be thinking that way, and that's where SCDC is perhaps a little bit different than other developers that have to be a little bit more short-sighted in terms of, gosh, we're going to fill this building in the short term. And I've got Gamazon who wants 1 million square feet. I'm going to build them downtown because that's where they want to be. But I think what we need to get people thinking about is in the long run. And that's, we're starting to do that. We've come up with some really compelling visionary plans for office complex in the city center, which we're going to start unveiling soon.
Wow.
And we're really focusing on more larger scale employers, more progressive, a lot of government organizations, which the government's always a little bit concerned, perhaps more so than the private sector, about being a competitive employer, because they're always trying to compete with the private sector that can always afford to pay more if they really need somebody. But what they've realized is if we can be closer to our employees, if we can save people an hour or an hour and a half a day in commuting, you know what, they're going to be willing to work for us. We're going to get that retention and that attraction.
So a battle of talent between public and private.
And I think in 10 years, you're going to actually find a lot of those companies that are right now attracted to downtown
Right.
are suddenly going to say, geez, we're going to having a hard time attracting employees if we want employees who are over 35 because they can't afford to live downtown.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of real sense in getting the city center going.
No kidding, and it's not even so much about the cost per square foot being less out here. I'm assuming it's a little less than downtown, but it's just more so the reality that like it's just like a talent thing because if people are living out here, I mean, yeah.
Yeah. So that is. I mean, you say it's less expensive out here. Well, it's.
I don't know.
It kind of costs the same to build a tower in Surrey as it does in downtown.
Okay,
Vancouver.
Interesting. Yeah.
But when you go above grade. Once you go below grade, that's where the difference is. So in downtown, it is so well served by a combination of things, by transit, and then housing that's within walking distance and cycling distance. So they don't need to build very much underground parking in downtown Vancouver. Surrey has got a bit of a disadvantage here. So we have transit, but not nearly the kind of quality of transit. Like I can get from my house in Kitsilano, I can get to my office in Surrey faster than a colleague who lives in Cloverdale.
Oh wow.
Which is crazy, right?
Right.
But that's just because the service just isn't there.
Yeah.
And similarly, they're starting to build these condos now, but they're not there yet, and so there's not a lot of people that can want to walk to work. But that's changing. I mean, the tower. There's just like literally dozens of towers that are going up, and that's going to change, and people will. And they're right now.
Obviously,
yeah, exactly. The residential. The market has discovered. This location for condos in particular, so there's no need for us to get involved in that kind of development. But,
it's just coming.
But we need to now have the workplace to go with those condos.
Well, yeah, because I'm sure they've come to you and been like, "Hey, we're building these condos. We want to pitch to people that their work might be around the corner. There's some interesting." Convenient things in there. Is there any kind of that dialogue?
Well, there's a little bit. I mean, I think. Right now, I suspect they're saying we're close to transit.
Step one, yeah.
And we've got the beginning of a city center. We've got the SFU Surrey, which has been, as I mentioned, it's been a huge success, and they're doing amazing things here. And then they're starting to get a bar scene and things like that. It's starting to happen. It's just early days, but it's definitely getting here. And I think the investment the city's made in things like the library has been really positive too.
I love it. And the next topic we'll talk about will be on the cultural side of Surrey. And just before we get there, I mean, a lot of the audience are real estate investors, mortgage brokers, people in professional services, and of course a lot of entrepreneurs. So I guess, so as far as investment opportunities, I mean, it seems like there's a lot of condos coming up. It's an up and coming area. I mean, people should probably be considering this over other areas. And they talk a lot about the Burquitlam area being up and coming. I mean, any insight on kind of just like the way the real estate market's going and
I think Surrey has been pretty steady. I mean, we're subject to the same kind of fluctuations that other people have, but I think there's sort of the fundamentals are so fundamentally good here that you're not subject to the vagaries of immigration and things like. Most people, for instance, that buy apartments here buy them for themselves. You don't get as much offshore investment here.
Oh, interesting.
So people tend to sort of buy an apartment to live in and then move up or whatever. Or maybe it might be a local investor who wants to buy one, but it's you're not getting that same kind of frothy market of international. So the prices, what they say, the prices won't go. You can get something here for like maybe a third less than Burnaby, and you're not going to be subject to the same downward pressure that Burnaby is. It's more steady here because people are buying them to live in them themselves. So the challenge is on the office side is how to make that make sense, because as I mentioned, it really costs the same. So while land is cheaper here than downtown Vancouver, that's really offset by the cost of having to build the extra parking. So it's almost a wash in terms of building here. So the kind of the rent you can charge, or if you're selling strat office, it's not radically different than downtown. But the long-term prospects, I think, are much brighter, because I think this market is going to be. There's much more future in this market. So if you can fill it in the short term, you're going to do very well in the long term. You're going to look like a genius 10 years from now.
And of course you're driving it. So on the cultural side, I know I had a question here around. A few things around culture and society, right? So first of all, obviously we're still in the COVID era at the time of this filming, and that has implications on transportation, office culture, etc. It's a whole other can of worms. But culturally, I mean, you know, you said there's some bars coming up in the area, and I know you're pretty passionate around like actually having events, or whenever you can do events, and having event arenas and things like that.
Yeah.
Culturally, how is Surrey a place that is starting to build culture? Where, I mean, really, there's been the stereotype that we all know around Surrey being a place that's not that nice and dangerous and blah blah blah. And again, people generalize, of course,
right.
but so I guess a two-pronged question. There's a challenge of the stigma of Surrey,
right.
and then you've got, again, the opportunity of culture, right? And of course, maybe even a more diverse immigrant culture. How do all those things come together to basically sell someone to want to come here because it's a better place economically, it's better for culture, and it just has that growth? How do those factors come together?
I think the culture side has got a lot of growing to do. I think one of the things you got to remember about Surrey is it's a very, very young city, not just demographically, like I was talking about earlier, but the city itself was only incorporated 26 years ago, 27 years ago, and so it doesn't have the kind of infrastructure that, say, Vancouver has, where cultural infrastructure, where it's been around for over 130 years, right?
Right. So it's not really a priority at the beginning. Like, I guess it comes down to like the timeline.
Yeah. So
right?
it is. I mean, I think it is coming along, but you've got a city that has is, I think, in terms of the sort of city bureaucracy, it's one of the most progressive on the continent.
Okay. Wow.
But
how so?
Well, I think you find them using new systems and methods that are like way more advanced than what Vancouver's. They kind of leapfrog over the bureaucracies that are more set in their old ways.
Where did that come from? That cultural.
Well, I think that I just think Surrey is kind of. It just seems to be part of the DNA here. Part of it is they have quite a low tax regime here, so their tax income per person in Surrey is less than half of what it is in Vancouver.
Wow. And
I think when you're operating, and they could use more money, I believe, but when you're operating in that kind of really constrained environment, it actually, at least the culture they've developed at the city is one of innovation. That we're gonna solve this not by any idiot can throw money at something and solve a problem, but it takes it takes a real genius to figure out how to do it smarter. And, the city has been. I must admit, they have been doing that in spades.
That's cool. I had no idea.
So it is one of the most progressive sort of city bureaucracies that I'm aware of, and I've worked all over the world before I took this job. So having said that, they do need to invest, and they've got some great libraries, and we walked by the Central Library, which is one of the finer libraries, not just as a structure, but in terms of the librarians. I think they have Vancouver VPL has like 9 times more librarians than Surrey has, but they still deliver amazing things, but they find different ways to deliver their services.
That's interesting. And was that, and so let's think of the modern day library. I mean, it's super nice.
Yeah.
Is that more of a thing for the students, or like are libraries kind of, I don't know, are they lost because of the Amazon world? Like, how do you see a library being
No, I mean, that's
useful?
what's really cool about libraries is you'd think, oh, no one buys books anymore, no one reads books, that's passé, but in fact, libraries are more important now than they've ever been before.
Interesting.
And again, Surrey being a new community, they're saying, gosh, where are communities meeting? Well, libraries is one of them, so they've chosen to invest in libraries.
It's a meeting place.
And exactly. So libraries aren't about books anymore.
Right.
I mean, they have books, and books aren't going to go away. Sure. But you're absolutely right. It's where people connect. So when we did this library here, it was actually all about space. And different kinds of space, and different kinds of space that are going to accommodate different things.
Right.
Not just today, but future-proofing it. What are we going to? So if you go into that library, you'll find some high spaces, some low spaces, some little spaces, lots of meeting rooms, because like
a lot of it's meeting gatherings, not like social gatherings. I'm guessing.
Then they have events there too.
And they
so
do have events.
Like
cool.
the library is like a natural amphitheater.
So that falls on the cultural side of things.
Oh wow! So they can. I've been there for talks and dances,
cool.
all kinds of cool
It's not like a be quiet culture.
No, in fact, we have there's actually a walled-off, glassed-in area, which is the quiet area. So you can be noisy everywhere else. And
wonderful.
They have a cafe on the ground floor,
new.
and it's and again, I got to credit the librarians as much as the architecture. I mean, it's a very progressive group. And
cool.
And so, yeah, if you've got a small business, you can rent a room there for your meetings, so you don't have to meet your clients at home. You can meet them at the library.
For people to know about that.
And that's just available, I think, for free. You just have to book it. They do have tremendous immigrant services. ESL, helping people get a job. All of that stuff is done through the library. So
are there a lot of immigrants in Surrey compared to Vancouver?
Well, it's interesting. It's actually in terms of
the
census information, it's very similar. So I guess people self-identify as immigrants in the census, and in both Vancouver and Surrey, it's in the kind of low 40% range. But the big difference is where the immigrants come from. So Vancouver, it's primarily sort of Asian, East Asian, Chinese, probably the largest demographic within that. In Surrey, it's South Asian, with sort of Indian, Punjabi being the largest demographic. So definitely still about 40% of our immigrants here. But I would say that there's maybe more newer immigrants here. You get more refugees in Surrey. But they have, there's a park called Holland Park, which is just on the other side of this building, and they have the most amazing festivals there. And one of them is this thing, which unfortunately they can't have this summer because of COVID, but it's called the Fusion Festival, and they have all of the different ethnic groups here are represented, and it's a real blast. It's really the best in the region.
Sure, pretty amazing food.
And that park also, they have, again, what Surrey does is they don't have the facilities, they don't really have the theaters and things which a city of this size should have, but they take the spaces they've got, the plaza at the city and the park, and they program the heck out of it, and they have amazing concerts, and they do that in partnership with the private sector, and so they're doing amazing stuff which draws from throughout the region. And again, this gets back to the innovation here. When they built the new city hall, like any city hall, you have to have a council chamber. Well, the council chambers were used like once a week, and then they break in the summer, but they said, well, if this is a big piece of real estate in the city hall, how can we use that more often? They said, well, you know what, we're going to design a council chamber that can be converted into a theater. So on non-council nights, there's, again, not during COVID, but they will have performances.
But they thought about that.
Performances and things there. So again, it's like, they don't have the money, so they got to get double use out of everything that they do, which is cool. Which is really cool. And there's so much that other cities can learn from them.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. Wow. So we've covered a lot. Just kind of starting to wrap up with, maybe just a bit about looking at the future, because obviously, as you said, that's something that is pivotal to what you do. So let's think of trends right now. Obviously, there's COVID. There's this sort of social distancing. I like to call it more physical distancing because I think people should be even more social, right? But the reality is, people are fairly distant. There's always been an issue of loneliness in Vancouver. I know that in Vancouver they've done a bunch of reports on that. So based off those trends, I'm guessing COVID is going to make it worse or leave it the same. I don't see it making the whole social isolation thing better. Possibly, right?
I think the COVID is. We do want to gather. That's just human basic instinct. I think COVID is going to accelerate. I don't think it's going to reinvent things, but it's going to accelerate trends that are happening already.
Right, and specifically doing real estate is kind of the big question
and so again, office is top of mind for me right now. So I'll talk to that first. But there's also the social side to that. Is what people have discovered over these last 4 months is that you can work from home pretty effectively.
Yes.
But they've been doing surveys now, and it's really interesting because on the surveys, I think at most 10 or 12% of the people say they would like to work at home full time. The other 90% want to come into the office.
Right.
Of that 90%, I think 40% would like to come in all the time, 45%, and 70% say they'd like to come in most of the time.
Yeah.
So I think what we're going to find is that a lot of people have discovered that working from home works way better than they expected. The people that have found it's worked really well actually is my generation, because we've always brought up saying, oh, you have to keep an eye on your employees and make sure they're doing their work. Well, what we've discovered is you don't. Actually, they're totally trustworthy, they're tech savvy, and they can be really productive working from home. There's no need for that, which is actually a huge lift of a burden for us, and we suddenly say, oh, I kind of like having that commute time for myself, and doing all that things. So I think this exercise has actually been really good for sort of the management, the older folks.
Right.
The people that I think have had the hardest time with it are actually the younger folks. And
right.
So they're the ones, well, partly they live in small places that may not have room to work,
right.
or if they've got a bunch of roommates, it's really difficult.
Roommates,
they're all working from home,
kids,
and it's really difficult,
madness.
and they're in this little thing. But also, in terms of their career, they need that interaction with the senior people for mentorship and to make the connections and the networking to get ahead. So, and that's not healthy, even though it's kind of nice for people like me that maybe we don't have to come in as much as we thought we did. We actually do, for the sake of the company, we have to come in and we have to have that interaction, which you just don't get on Zoom. So, so what I see is that's going to have two implications. I think one is kind of a macro, and this is, I think, very advantageous for Surrey, is that people are not going to be, the majority of people are not going to necessarily be coming into work all the time. They're going to be coming in for part days.
Right.
Well, you don't want to be commuting 2 hours to come in for 2 hours for a meeting, right? That's lunacy, right? So, so again, if all the people are living out here, you want to have offices closer to where people live.
Right.
And that's huge.
Especially more flex.
Exactly. So that's huge for Surrey. So again, if you are a
so that helps. I was thinking like maybe that would work against you, because then people aren't coming to the office. You're building all these office buildings. Like, well, what's the point if people are working at home? But you don't think it's gonna.
But I think so. What we're going to see, I think, is there's going to be more demand for having workplaces closer to where people live.
Right. Because of the flex time.
That's right, and I think the so that's a big thing. The other side is people who work from home are actually going to want bigger places.
Well, for sure.
And if you look at existing housing stock, not talking about new housing stock, Surrey's got it in the spades. This is where all the big units are. And as I mentioned, they're not all single family houses. You know, there's a ton of people here that live in kind of duplex, triplex scaled housing and townhouses. But they're all bigger because land is less expensive here. They're all bigger than what you get in Vancouver. And they've been designed for families, and this is where the families are coming.
Right.
So it works very well from those 2 points of view. Then the other thing that I think COVID is going to hit us, and it's kind of like 9/11. You know, after 9/11, everyone said, "Oh, no one's going to work in a tower ever again."
Right.
But in fact, within a few years, we were building towers, but we were building them taking into account security. So now, particularly if you're in a big city in the States, you go through all the security at the base, and the buildings are reinforced so they won't fall down if there's a bomb or something like that. So that has been built in, and sure enough, we're building in towers again. We're going to come back and build office buildings again, but they're going to be designed to allow for this physical distancing, for that kind of flexibility, so that if you had to, you can spread apart, and otherwise you can come together.
Right.
And there's going to be all kinds of technological things, or, you know, touchless entry, HVAC systems that are going to have all kinds of filters and fresh air and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
That kind of technology, which is these days is smart technology, that's what they're talking about. That is much easier to embed in a new building than retrofitting an old building. So again, when you're building a new downtown, you can be building this stuff in from the ground floor. So we're going to have a huge advantage. We're going to be building the building, you know, at the micro level, we're going to be building the buildings that are responding to the sort of post-pandemic realities. But also we have the fundamentals on the macro side that we're going to be building closer to where people live. So that's on the office side. You know, it's kind of a chicken and egg thing. I think once we get the daytime population here, we're going to get, like right now we got restaurants that there's not enough trade to do dinner and lunch, but as soon as we get the offices, you can get the two trade, and that's going to make them much more viable. And so I think that's coming. Hopefully the city is going to start investing more in some of their cultural infrastructure, you know, growing their sort of theaters and museums and that kind of stuff in the city center. But it's going to come, and I think it's and again, you know, this is where the families are too. So if you have kids, you actually kind of want to be with other people that have kids, because all the stuff is going to be happening here. And the rec centers, this is where the more kids play soccer in Surrey, I think, than anywhere else. You know, there's more dance schools in Surrey than any other city.
What schools for it?
Dance schools in Surrey than any other city in Canada. So it's happening, and when you live here, you recognize that it's happening. But it's not, you know, because, you know, I talk about the people who are under 19 living here, so lots of kids. And once you get over 35, there are lots of people living. But there's the missing kind of sandwich, which is the 20 to 35-year-olds. Those guys all move into Vancouver. And so we're actually missing, we need to grow the kinds of stuff that attracts the 20 to 35-year-olds. But until you have them, it's hard to justify it.
Right.
But it's really interesting, you know, talking to people that own clubs and bars in Vancouver. They're saying a lot of our clientele actually come from Surrey, you know, so they're starting to sniff around. So that's going to change.
Right. Nice to know going more local.
Yeah.
I remember a couple of Surrey bars that we had come out to from Vancouver, but I don't think they lasted very long.
Yeah.
There's some like Tap House. I think is one. I think they've got one location around here. There's some decent ones, especially.
Yeah. No, and it's growing, and it's been really interesting looking at, you know, it's easy to get caught up with the incredible growth statistics here, but what's changing, it's not just the numbers are getting bigger, but the profile of the people that are moving out here is changing. So when I first came out here in the late 90s to do work as an architect, and you looked at the kind of demographics back then, and then you compare that to the demographics in the latest census, the number of people with university degrees is like up by almost 300%. So the people up, and the incomes are way up as well.
Right.
So that is having as big a profound impact in terms of the city as the gross numbers, as the people that are moving out here are going to start demanding the kind of services and activities that you're talking about.
That's kind of the catalyst, right?
Yeah.
Forward thinking, let's say 10, 20, 30 years, we get really futuristic here. I guess city design in general, like there's that great book, Happy City, right?
Right.
I think he's local actually, he did a TED Talk here. Like what do you see some societal and tech trends that will influence the way you envision the buildings of the future, especially in Canada?
Well, I mean, I think technology is obviously going to be a big part in the smart buildings and all of that stuff, but I think it's having community interaction is going to be really big. Right. And I think that as Surrey densifies, we're going to be able to have more of that. One of the things people are talking about in the sort of COVID situations, they're talking about the 15-minute neighborhood, so that within 15-minute walk of where you live, you have everything you need. You have the sort of the grocery stores, the libraries, you know, the schools, everything. And I think that is where, as Surrey starts to fill in, we need to be thinking about that 15-minute neighborhood. The city center that I'm talking about is more like a second central business district, but on top of that, we have to layer on top of that this 15-minute neighborhood that's going to allow people to do more from home than what they presently are doing, and maybe even small satellite offices for different companies in these neighborhoods. And I think that kind of scale of development is going to be what I think drives more coherent neighborhoods. Like everyone's talking about retail being dead and retail streets dying, but you know, having spent the last 3 months in Kits and going out to pick up my groceries and stuff, the street retail has never been more alive. It's kind of neat. Yeah,
no, that's great. I think that's all was a really important observation. It seems like the first domino in really creating that 15-minute neighborhood, I guess it just comes down to offices being down here, people having no reason to go to downtown Vancouver, and then they start to demand or invest in things in their area since they're literally here now most of their time. Is that correct?
Well, I think just generally everywhere.
Like
when people are working from home, you think that they want to work from home. They don't want to have to drive and do errands. So they want to have all that stuff near them. And then if a couple of times a week they come into the city center for meetings with their team or that kind of stuff, then it's nearby. They don't have to waste an hour and a half each way.
Yep, makes perfect sense. Well, we covered a lot. Is there anything that we didn't cover that you want to leave people off with?
Probably. We focused on the Surrey City Centre, but Surrey is like a huge city. As I mentioned, it was like 5 different towns. And it's like literally, geographically, it's 2.5 times the size of Vancouver. We just talked about one kind of fifth of the city, but it's an exciting place.
Yeah, that's excellent. Well, Michael, thanks again. This has been a pleasure. For those watching, there's a lot of things for you to digest. I mean, some of my highlights were, first of all, going on that walking tour and just seeing how progressive the buildings are. Even the library, to say that that's a place that was designed to have culture in it and for it to be loud goes against everything I grew up learning about. So I think that point around how you're building a lot faster because you have so much more room than Vancouver. You have this foresight and the advantage to build buildings from the ground up and have smart tech and multi-purpose buildings. And I think also, like coming from the startup world, I think the best way to have creativity is through constraints. So the fact that is something that's just, it's a reality and it's fueled your culture to be, as you said, one of the most progressive. I mean, arguably in the world as far as a municipality, right? I think is super interesting, and I think there's things that that will eventually bleed into the people that frequent here, as you said, some of the office buildings, and just people that start to invest, whether it's restaurants, entertainment. I think it has to start from the core, and people usually think, well, the library, the school, the city, they're probably the people that are not that exciting, but if they're the ones leading it, then you think it would influence everyone else. That makes me really optimistic. So yeah, again, thanks again for watching, everyone, and as always, keep leveling up your living. Michael, thanks again. This was a pleasure.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot.
Cheers. Just kidding. Perfect. Thanks again. Great.